All right, welcome everyone to the Xojo webinar. I am Paul Lefevre, the Xojo Developer Evangelist. And our topic this time is iOS view navigation. So what are views or iOS views? They're what you see on the screen. They contain the UI controls that are displayed. Now you can have a single view on a screen. That's pretty common for iPhone apps. You can also use tabs, which essentially each tab is its own view, and you can tap on the tab indicator to switch to a different view. On an iPad, you can have what's called a split, and this essentially allows you to show two views side by side. Normally, this only displays when the iPad is held horizontally, but you can also tweak it so that you can see both those views when the iPad is held in portrait mode. So for displaying views, well, most common thing you've probably seen is that you push a new view onto the screen to display it. This essentially slides the new view over the current view, and you see a little animation about that. And it kind of maintains a view hierarchy so that when you do that, there'll be a back button that shows on the new view that's now displayed. And when the user taps that, that displayed view disappears and the view that was previously displayed is now shown. So that's what you commonly tend to see in iOS apps. It's a pretty simple metaphor. You're just, displaying new views on top of the ones that are currently there, and then you're getting rid of them to show the ones that were underneath. You can also display a view modally, a modal view. And much like modal dialogues or windows on desktop or dialogues that are in web apps, these sort of views will display on the screen, and then you can't interact with anything else until the view is specifically closed. So it doesn't really affect the view hierarchy, so to speak, because it just kind of shows up and then you close it, and then you can go back to what you were working on underneath. Xojo does not have built-in support yet for modal views, but they're pretty straightforward to add using some declares, and we'll look at that. I mentioned the split view, and you can also set this up. This is, like I said, two views on the screen at the same time. Typically, it's a master and then a detail type of setup. Probably something you've seen with like the Mail app. If you hold that horizontally on an iPad, you get a list on the left-hand side of, say, all the messages. And then you can tap on a specific message, and then the message itself displays on the right-hand side. And tabs also, I mentioned before, same sort of thing. You'll get buttons. Tab buttons, well, I guess they're not really buttons, but they're things you can tap, and they appear on the bottom of the iOS device screen, and you can tap them to switch to the different views. Something like, I think the Clock app, or maybe, probably the Clock app has tabs across the bottom that you may be familiar with. And then with Xojo, you can also change the screen entirely to something completely different. This is new to, I think it's 2016 R1. And this allows you to completely alter the screen for a variety of reasons. You may want to completely swap out a screen and not necessarily just push a new view in place, so that this allows you to, essentially wipe out the view hierarchy, so to speak. And there may be places where you want to swap between something like a split or a tab. And otherwise, you wouldn't really have a way to do that unless you can swap out the screen. And we'll look at an example of that as well. A common thing you might want to do, for example, is have an initial view for your app that's maybe a login screen or something like that. And then after the user successfully logs in, you want to show your actual app. And your actual app may be more sophisticated, may have a split or tabs or something like that. And you want that to just be the topmost level, if you will. And as I said, it essentially removes the view hierarchy, so that the back button isn't enabled and there is no back to go to, really. So we're going to look at a few different projects in Xojo that cover those things. We'll look at a simple one that covers push to. We'll look at one that has some declares to show you how to do a modal. We'll look at a split and a tab and a change screen. So here we are in Xojo. And this is the simplest of the projects. This is the simple push to example. You can see here there are only two views here in the project, view 1 and view 2. They don't specifically do anything. The point is just to show you how you can navigate between them. And the idea is that view 1 is the default view that comes up. It has a button on it. And its code simply shows view 2. And this is using the push to method. And you can see the pretty simple syntax here. You create a new instance of your view you want to display. And then you call the push to method and pass in the new view. The self here is optional. I put it here for clarity, but it certainly would work without it. You could just call push to like that. And then when you run the project, of course, the simulator starts up and boots. And now you have the default view displayed, and when I click it, you can see the second view slides into place. And you can see here there's a button here that has a name, view 1, that if I click will take me back to view 1. Now by default that's going to say back if you don't specifically put anything in on it, but you can put any text you want there. So I put text here. And then the other way you can go back to the prior view is all right, so you've got the back button that lets you go back to the prior view, and you can also just close the current view to go back to the prior view. And it has the same effect. And the close method is just calling close. So if we look at view 2 here, you'll see it also has a button. And it just is calling the close method for the view to get rid of it, and that takes you back to the original view. Looking back at the original view, I was talking about the back button and what you see there. You can see right here I filled in the back button title, view 1. Now, something that can trip people up is the title you specify on the view, but it's not actually displayed on this view. It's displayed on the view that appears on top of this view. So essentially you think of this text as the text that the view that covers this view up is going to display, so you can get back to this view. This view obviously isn't going to show a back button because it's the first view that shows up. But when view 2 is displayed, it's going to cover up view 1 and show a back button. And if I just left it blank, whoops, it looked like it might have put the text back. Yeah, I think it did. Let's just, I'm going to stop it here so the simulator starts up a little quicker next time. Let me go that way. And, well, it's still saying view 1. I would have thought it would have said back. All right, well, don't take my word for it. But that's where the text that you want to display, should you want something fancy to show, is going to show up there. So that's general navigation. You can have any number of these sort of things, multiple buttons that can trigger new views to display. They can be navigation buttons up here that cause things to display. They can be toolbar buttons that display on the bottom that can cause new views to display. Whatever you want, but push to is the simple way to get those up on the screen. So now let's take a look at Modal. So I'll first run this real quick here. So a modal view, we're not going to tweak these things just yet, but this displays a view over the current view, of course. You'll see, I don't know if you noticed, but it kind of slid up from the bottom. I don't know if that gets picked up by the webinar software, but there's an animation that slides from the bottom. And at this point, you've got a full view that's covering the area, and you can't. There's no back buttons or anything like that to get to the other thing. You actually have to add a button or something on the view to allow it to close, so that it'll go away and the other view can be shown. Now you can tweak this thing a little bit to have some other mechanisms for showing it. That did a little animation of kind of a 3D spin. This one is more of a kind of a fade, crossfade kind of thing. And this one does the page curl, kind of flip up and down. So those are all fun little effects that you can do for Modal. The presentation style only works on iPads, so we'll need to restart the simulator in iPad mode to look at those. And let me do that real quick before we look at the code. While we wait for this to boot, Douglas is noting here that maybe I need to save the project before running it again to have the back button show the default value. And I don't know. If that's the case, that certainly feels like a bug. I'm going to want to play with that a little bit after the webinar to see what the situation is there. To be honest, I don't normally try that sort of thing. Usually I put text in there and then you don't worry about it again. So I'll play with that afterwards. All right, so here we have an iPad. And I'm going to switch it to rotate. This is actually showing a split, which we'll look at in a little bit. But actually, I don't. If we just let it go up normally, you can see it kind of get a full screen modal view that comes up. But if you pick a few values here, I think only 1, 2, and 3 work. This one's a little bit more restricted. Looks like it's got the full height, but it's a little narrower, so you can still see a little bit of what's behind. And this one is smaller still and centered, so you can see more of what's behind here. And there are other values that Apple has listed in their docs that you can put here, but the declares I have in this project not configured to make any use of them at this point. So let's look at what we have for code here. So if you look at the button, this is the button on the view to show the modal view, and all it does is it's just getting the little values for the transition in the presentation from the fields, and then it's calling this show modal method. That is an extension method I've added to the iOS view class. And this passes in the parent view and then an integer for the presentation and the transition. And if you look at the method here, so here I have an extension method, and it's just 3 declares that do this. And the first declare sets the presentation style and then the transition style. And you can see there's 3 types here that I've tested and appear to work fine. And then the 4 types here seem to work as well. The trick is, of course, not to mix and match wrong things that the Apple docs indicate will cause exceptions. And that's things like trying to use a partial curl transition with a form sheet presentation. I think when I tried that, the app just immediately throws an exception and you're back to the iPhone's main screen. So you don't want to do weird stuff like that. I'm pretty sure all of these things require this to remain at 0. But you can see these declares are pretty straightforward. They're accessing the UIKit library. These 2 here are properties in the Apple's iOS framework, and they only have simple values, so they're pretty easy to set. If you were to read the docs, you would actually see that this property is just called modal presentation style, and part of the process of translating it to a declare is you have to add the word set to the beginning and then tweak the case. So in Apple's docs, you would see that that would actually be called Modal presentation style, like that. And so that's the same thing I did on these two here. And then the actual method that displays the modal view is this one here, the present view controller animated completion method. And this requires the parent view, the new view, and then a couple booleans, or a boolean here to animate it. And then I'm not passing in anything for the completion, but with more work, you could actually hook up some sort of iOS block of code that gets called after the view is displayed. But this is the simplest level of the code you can do to add an iOS view, iOS modal view to your project. So pretty straightforward to use. The other little companion method is the close modal method, which you have to call to actually close the modal view. You can't just call the Xojo built-in close method. And but you can see you just call it like that, and that closes the modal view. So pretty darn easy to use. I'll have this example project included in the next version of Xojo. There is a slightly less sophisticated version of this in the current version of Xojo. If you go to the iOS folder and pick, you go to examples, iOS, and then in declares, I believe, yes, there is a modal view in here already. I don't think it's configured as an extension method, and it doesn't support the presentations and transitions, but it does display things modally. I'll get this updated one in the next version of Xojo, and as well I'll have it available on the page for this webinar so you can download it before R2 ships. All right, the next one we want to take a look at here is the split view. And this is something you're going to use on an iPad. So this is already set up to run, I believe. Oh, no, it's not. So let's set it to run on an iPad. So when you set up a split view, when you go to the iPad screen, you'll see there's another option here called split. And you can pick that. And when you do that, you get two new properties that show up, left and right. And they allow you to specify the views that appear on the left-hand side and the right-hand side. Now, when in portrait view, you generally aren't going to see both of those views at the same time. So you can tweak it to landscape here to see what it might look like when you run it. And you can see it's showing the master view here on the left, the detail view on the right. So that's how you kind of set that up. And the views here are just separate views. So one for the master and one for the detail. So if I run this, now because the iPad started in portrait mode, we're not seeing both of the views because by default it's going to show, as you can see here, the detail screen, which may not be super useful to you. But if you rotate it, then both the items come into play and you can click on them and show stuff. And you can also combine the techniques. So here I have a button down here that's going to push a new view on top of the details view. And you can see that works the same as how push would work. It slides it on top of just the view on this side and gives you a back button that you can then click to go back to what was there before. All right, now what if we wanted to actually have a little bit more info show when it's in portrait view? Well, again, you can use a couple declares, or actually one declare that you can set a couple different ways. So this project has a declare that lets you set the display mode for the split, so you can control when and how it's displayed. So I'm going to uncomment this line here first. And this one will still start up the the app with it in portrait mode and just the details showing, but it'll allow you to swipe from the left, which might be a little tricky for me to do in the simulator, and then it'll show the other view, the master view, kind of in a little overlay. So let's see what that looks like. So if you come near the edge, I clicked and kind of quickly dragged the mouse over, and I was able to pull this into display here. Actually, let me pull that back in. I wanted to do that when it was like this. Apparently it also works when it was that way, but so it also works in portrait as well, and you can still click. And I guess I'm trying to get rid of it here. Some of these gestures are really tricky to do with the mouse, and then you get rid of it and you can see the screen. So that's what that particular setting does. And then if we enable this one, it'll just force both of them to show, even when it's in portrait mode. So you can see here they're both displayed on the screen. The details one essentially is a bit scrunched here, as you know, both are trying to be fit. But that might be a type of layout you want to do as well. And of course, if we switch it to the left, it still displays how we would expect. So let's look at that declare. And this is just a single method, set preferred display mode. And also, I don't remember offhand, but it sure looks like that is probably a property that is sitting on UIKit for the screen, and because it has this set here, and that almost always indicates that it's a property. And then you're just passing in an enumeration value. It's converted to integer so that it matches with Apple's stuff, but you can see the different values that are right here. So that's how a split works. Very handy when you're creating iPad apps. And one tip for people, if you are creating an iPad app and you really only want it to run in landscape mode, you can turn off on these switches here. Just turn off the portrait settings so that only the two landscape settings are enabled. And then when you actually just run in the simulator, it'll auto switch over for you. And it'll also force it that way. If the user taps on the app on an actual device, it'll run in landscape mode automatically. So if you don't want to bother designing your app to handle, every possible way that it can fit on the screen, you just want to say, no, this only makes sense to be used in landscape mode. You can turn those things off so that that's the way it works. Edwin is asking if it's possible to make a split view on an iPhone with the declare that I just showed here, and no, splits don't work on the iPhone, so you're out of luck there. There's just not enough screen space. Technically, the iPhone Plus model has some sort of weird split kind of thing that sometimes can be used, but it's not the same as this split, and Xojo does not have native support for that at this point. And I don't think it's too commonly used on the 6 Plus, but I don't know much more about that. And Edwin is also asking here, is there a way to display a modal view like the Facebook app where the main view slides to the right, but not all the way, and then the modal appears underneath? I am not familiar with that. So I can't really say. What I'm showing you here is the stuff that I've actually done, so I don't know about that particular technique. I suppose it might be possible, but I don't know offhand. All right, let's move on to the next project here, which is tab bar. And let's see here. So this project here, you set up your tab bar, and you can do this on iPads and phones. You can change the content here to say tabs, and then you get a couple extra properties, and you get to set the content for the tabs, or you can just click the edit button here, and then you can see each tab. You can add new tabs. You can set the icon for each tab or a label. And unfortunately, the icons are not showing up in the viewer right here. I created a bug for that this morning when I noticed that. But the icons you can see are right here. So I have two icons, a chair and a globe. And they're 2x sizes, so I just dragged them in here into the 2x spot. I think the only iOS device that is still 1x at this point is the original iPad mini. I think all the other ones that are supported by iOS 8 and up are 2x at least. So that's how you set up the tab. And of course, each tab is just, its own view. And as you can see, that was what was when you've created the tabs here and you switch to them, you can specify the view for each one. You do have to come down here and click to switch to the tabs so you can set the view, but that's how you set them. And then when you run it, you can see the tabs show up on the bottom, and you can just tap them to jump between. Pretty straightforward. Of course, you can have whatever you want for tabs, but like anything else, screen space can be limited, so these aren't the sort of things where you're going to want to have a lot. But that is pretty easy to set up. And if you go to the iPad, you can see you also have access to the tabs, of course. And one other thing I didn't show on the split view is you can actually combine these sort of things. So if we looked at the iPad screen and you went down to here, you can actually put tabs within each of the areas of the split. So you could go for an even fancier type of display where you could have the details you could say I want tabs on the details, and then you could have multiple views showing on the details that people can switch between. So you can set up some slick little stuff there. Now the last thing I want to show is the ability to change screens. And this kind of pulls everything together, so you can pretty much create whatever you're looking for a navigation path. So we'll just run this real quick so you can see what this does. So this is going to kind of do that little login thing that I mentioned earlier. All right, so the initial screen for the app is a login screen. Doesn't actually do anything. And then the button here shows the main screen. And you'll notice it didn't slide in or anything like that. It just appeared. There's no back button or anything like that. If I do decide to show the detail view, then I get the back button and it slides into place. But the login view is essentially at this point taken out of the equation. It's not part of the view hierarchy, and you don't need it to. You don't want the user to necessarily go back to it just by using regular navigation. Now you may want to provide a way to get back to it by having a special button or something. Like here, the log out button takes them back to that front screen. And again, you'll know there's no back button or anything, so they can't get back to the main screen. So that's pretty cool. That gives you more flexibility over your navigation. And you can also tweak this a bit farther. So let's well, before I run the other code to do the other thing. So you can see the difference in how the screen is being set is I still create the new view. But rather than pushing it over the current view, I am changing the current screen content property to point to that particular view. And that's it. It's pretty easy once you know it. Now, the other things you can do is actually replace that screen with tabs or even a split. And I'm going to run this, and then we'll look at the code after. So same login thing, I'll hit the button. And then here we can see the main view now appeared, but there's now tabs that are showing up here that I can click on. I can still use this one here in this tab, and it works as it did before with the navigation. I can click the log out, and it goes back to the main screen, and everything is gone away. The tab is removed. All nice. And what does that look like? Well, essentially, you're just creating the parts you need right in code, and then you're doing the same command to change the current screen's content. So here I'm creating a new tab bar, and then I'm creating my views, and I'm adding them to the tab bar. And then I reassign the main screen to be the tab that I've just created and added the views to. Again, pretty straightforward. And then similarly, let's run the split, and then you'll see the code. It's almost exactly the same. What good is running a split on an iPhone? Didn't Edwin just ask me this? See, I crashed it. All right, so I got to go back here and switch this over to an iPad. All right, so now we have an iPad, and I log in, and now I've got the split showing up here, and it's showing my two views. I didn't add any special code to this particular thing, so it's actually going to push the view over this area when normally you'd probably want it to. Well, in this case, you probably don't even need to show this because you're displaying the detail view right alongside it. But I didn't put any special custom code there. And then clicking the logout button kind of wipes all that away and takes you back to the main login screen. And as you can see, the same overall code, creating a new split view, and then create the main view and assign it to the master property, and then the detail view, assign it to the detail property, and then assign that whole thing to the current screen's content. And that's it. So that's the many different ways you can do your iOS app navigation with Xojo. Variety of options here. And the change screen feature that was added in 2016 R1 gives you even more power to kind of combine everything together to create whatever you can hopefully imagine. And then wrapping up, of course, I want to remind people to try Xojo yourself. We offer Xojo as a free demo with no time limit, which you can grab from xojo.com/download. Adding iOS support starts at $2.99 for the ability to make iOS apps, and that's also included with Xojo Pro, of course, if you already have Xojo Pro. Don't forget to check out the Dev Center, which has lots of documentation on the framework itself, the language itself, and iOS coding and all kinds of things. And it is updated pretty much daily with new content, so be sure to head on over there when you're looking for information. And of course, Xojo Developer Conference 2016 is October 5th to 7th in Houston, Texas this year. And you can find out more at xojo.com/xdc. Get a list of the sessions, the presenters, all kinds of cool stuff that's going to be happening in Houston. And now we've reached the end, so let me wander over to my question window here. All right. Edwin is asking, can you push a view on the right split from the left split? Yes, absolutely. You can push a view onto any part of the split that you want from any other part of the split. You have complete access to the split's properties, and you can see how that works here. If I am able to get back to Xojo. So if you look at the split example here, let's take a look at the info button. So if I go to the master view and we look at the info button, you can see this code here. When you click the info button, it pushes a view on top of the detail view, even though the info button is part of the master view. And here it just does checking. So it's checking if there's a split view being displayed. And if there is, it converts it casts right here. This is the property you want, parent split view dot detail, and then it casts that to a detail view, and then it calls a method I have on there to show the info view. So yeah, absolutely, you can do that. You have access to all the properties that you can access to make those tweaks. All right, and Edwin is also noting here, just noting that you don't need an Apple developer membership to test iOS apps on an iPhone. And I guess he's noting that. That is true. You do not need an Apple developer membership to test iOS apps on an iPhone. Although it's sure a lot easier if you do have one. But if you don't have one, I do have steps here in the Dev Center. What is that called? Pro. Yeah, right there. It's the first item. So there's some steps here where you have to go through a bunch of stuff in Xcode and to do a bunch of configuration. But in the end, you'll end up with something you can use that'll actually let you deploy to a device for testing without having to pay Apple their $99 developer membership fee. So that's certainly an option for you if you're looking to test things out, but aren't yet fully ready to commit to iOS. All right. Well, I want to thank everyone for attending our webinar this time. Certainly, if you have questions on this or any other Xojo-related topic, you can always reach me at paul@xojo.com. Have a great day, everyone.